Welcome, everybody. Welcome. I'm happy to see such a big and happy audience. I'm even more happy to see Bo Roshan here again, a frequent visitor to the Institute, affiliated with the Institute. We're very happy about. For those who don't know, he's nowadays a senior professor of political science in Gothenburg. He claims to be retired from the Quality of Government Institute, but I can tell you that's false news. He has at least 10% there, I think, or something like that. Used to be the chair in political science in Gothenburg, and also had a stint in Oxford as a professor there. And did finish his thesis on the social democratic state, reforms and governance in the Swedish labour market and school politics, supervised by Lennart Lundqvist and Göran Tärborn and Gunnar Olofsson. And he's going to talk about populism, epistemic democracy and equality government. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Gustav, and thanks to the Institute. It's just great to be here. I'm so happy. Yes, this is a talk about three different approaches: populism, epistemic democracy, and quality of government that are quite different. There are many scholars who go very deep into one approach, and that is, of course, often very rewarding. I'm more interested in mixing. I'm like a bartender, so my head is like a blender, so I see what happens if you mix different approaches and see what can come out. When Gustav mentioned my dissertation, and some of you that I see in this audience are old enough to remember it maybe, where I mixed Marxist state theory with organizational theory and implementation theory. So this is what I do as a social scientist. We'll see how this will work. So let's start with the epistemic conception of democracy. This was coined by a well-known political philosopher in Oxford, Cohen.
It's not the Oxford Cohen.
Sorry?
That's not the Oxford
No,
Cohen.
I know, no. I know. That's not Oxford. Another Cohen, yeah. Who, in an argument with social choice theorists, who pointed out that well-known Kenneth Arrow impossibility theorem made it very difficult to construct from an electorate a will. I think this is a blind alley, so that is not where I go. But what he said is that epistemic democracy requires an independent standard of correct decisions. That is an account of justice and the common good that is independent of current consensus and the outcomes of votes. And this is, of course, quite controversial and for many normatively unwanted. But the main question is, if what should count as correct decisions cannot come from the democratic process as such, where should this independent standard of correct decisions come from? And my take on this comes mainly from this book. It's maybe two of the world leading scholars in studying elections and opinion formation, Christopher Ahern and Larry Bartels. And the title is Democracy for Realists: Why Elections Do Not Produce Responsive Governments. And their main argument is that elections cannot be seen as producing a will of the people, what they call the folk theory, a type of ideas about how democracy should work that is very common. And this can therefore not be implemented by a government. But it's even more worrying because they also show, mainly from American data, but not only, that elections also do not work for accountability, retrospective voting, meaning that voters can sort of judge if they are happy with the current government, and if not, vote the rascals out of office. Voters are too uninformed, too tribal, too short-sighted, and so on. That doesn't mean that they are Achene Batel are anti-democrats. They say democracy comes with many other things, civil rights, freedom of expression, reasonable, peaceful change of government and so on. But I'm very much into this argument, and I can also see that my colleagues, especially in Gothenburg, this is an argument they don't want to touch. They think it's too normatively problematic. So I tried to convince them that they should do something with this, but no. But I think we see this in the current elections, that Swedish voters are too short-sighted, both looking forward, so they trade saving the planet from a climate catastrophe for lower fuel prices. And they're also too short-sighted backwards, so they discount that our second largest party has a very clear history in neo-fascist and neo-Nazi groups. That is discounted. So I think they have a point here. So what to do with this? One can think of epistemic democracy as a response to the problem that democratic procedures do not always produce decisions that are true, meaning that they are in line with science and knowledge, or fair. And fair is mainly nowadays handled by the human rights approach. If you think about it, actually very few people now talk about democracy. They say democracy and human rights as if it was one thing. But it is not, right? but that is the development we have, right? That we want to produce democracy and human rights. True has not a similar place about the discussion, but of course for political philosophers this goes back to Plato's idea of the guardian state and his question, why should the many and not the more knowledgeable rule? Which is of course still very relevant. So I think it's what should count as fair is, I think, the human rights agenda. But the problem is well known. And from here comes this approach that I call quality of government. It shows that democracy is not a safe cure against systemic corruption. And of course not, we know that it's not a safe cure against violation of human rights. And in a book published a number of years ago together with a young colleague, Aisha Baraj, we tried to put together the corruption perspective with the human rights perspective, arguing that violations of what we think is quality of government, that is systemic corruption, also have a very negative effect on human rights. Making sense of corruption is so. And of course we have many disturbing current examples around the world of illiberal democracy. Now, the fair thing is one thing, but the truth is another. There are a number of examples. One of my often talked about examples is the former president of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki, and his policies against HIV/AIDS that seem to have costed some 380,000 South Africans a premature death. I don't know much about it, but I've also heard that Ronald Reagan delayed research about medicine for HIV/AIDS, and that also costed a lot of human lives. I've also heard from colleagues at Malmö University that the Swedish policy against hard drug users have had the same effect, but I'm not very knowledgeable about this. But we have now a Swedish member of parliament denying the existence of the climate crisis. And one problem here is, in many cases, democracies are surprisingly unable to increase human well-being. That would, of course, have been, and many of my colleagues who study democracies say, well, democracy is good because the people want more human well-being, education, healthcare and so on. If you have democracy, the system will deliver. Well, unfortunately, this is not the case. I think this is my normative standpoint. It's not original. It goes. I'm taking it from Amartya Sen, a well-known political philosopher and an economist. His capability approach. I think this should be the independent standard when you evaluate democratic performance. Can the democracy actually increase human capability as he defines it? And this is, of course, also, he is very much behind the United Nations Human Development Index. So this is not very original. And the problems are related because high levels of corruption, which is the fair thing, are detrimental to increase in human well-being. This can be shown. Now, populism. This is a chart I've taken from Stefan. This is how the social sciences and humanities have increased their interest in populism. And you can see we have an explosion of interest in this field, going back to some 2010, you can say, is the explosion. And here are some well-known faces of populism. I think guess you know them all. The most of men, but we now have the new Italian prime minister, a woman here. So, is there a relation here between populism and what we have called quality of government? One thing you can say about populism generally, it's built on replacing the established left-right dimension in politics with a dimension between the clean-hearted but misled people versus the corrupt and self-serving political elites. That's, I think, the main idea behind populism. And it's not only the established political parties, but also various groups of experts and professionals, and the media elites and the cultural elite. These experts are, in populist thinking, not seen as impartial or having useful knowledge, but at serving this corrupt political establishment. I'm maybe a little caricature, but this is how I've taken it. And you can say that there is, from the populists, no such thing as impartial expert knowledge that can inform political decisions. Everything is political and a form of power. Very similar, actually, to postmodernism and what comes out from Michel Foucault, I think. So, what are my colleagues who are doing all this research about populism interested in? Most of it is about explaining why an increasing number of voters support populist parties. Who are these voters? Where do they come from? What are their motives? This is, of course, very important and has received a lot of attention. But the question I'm interested in, what do the populists do when they actually have power? As some of you know, I'm more interested in politics from the implementation side than from the political mobilization side. And one answer that has been given from one of the most important researchers in populism is his term, they colonize the state. That's what they do. Now, take a look at this. This is the Oxford Handbook of Populism. I love these handbooks, not for what is in them, but you can look what is not in them. I use this a lot, actually. And you can go to the index and you can see that there is nothing on administration, public policy, bureaucracy, implementation, public management, or experts. Nothing. And this is some 800 pages or something. Zero. Or civil service. No. So what do experts do in a liberal democracy? Well, they give, of course, advice. But we also have a number, if you think about it, areas in a liberal democracy where experts and not politicians play the main role. We have the idea of independent courts. We have the idea of academic freedom. We have the idea of culture freedom, that we shouldn't have the local politicians decided which book in the public library or which plays the public theater should play. There are experts also in culture, we think. Central banks, independent organization for auditing the public sector are very important. The medical profession. And there are many other professions and semi-professions in the public sector who work with considerable autonomy based on some type of expert knowledge. I'm not 100% sure there is expert knowledge in culture, but I prefer those semi-experts to having politicians deciding this. And here the idea is quite simple. You should recruit and promote people not based on their political loyalties or ideas, but based on their actual merits for the job. And this, of course, if you think about it, implies quite a limited role for democratic majoritarianism in a liberal democracy. Less is more. Is there a problem in the Swedish constitution? This is a little sideshow, but there is a formulation that I think is problematic in the Swedish constitution. It reads in Swedish: Det allmänna skall verka för att demokratins idéer blir vägledande inom samhällets alla områden. I'm not really sure we want this. If it's interpreted as we should have the mayor in cities deciding what is to be carried out in the cultural sector, for example. So, my interpretation of trying to read up about populism is that they have a kind of democratic totalitarian idea. So the political majority should have total power over the state. Every public institution and public policy should mirror the will of the people as understood by the populist politicians. You see attacks on independent courts, for example, very clear. Nancy Bermeo, another researcher, she has termed this executive aggrandizement. I'm not sure I can... that the executive sort of take all the power. And you have Miller, of course. And the idea is then that the recruitment and promotion to these sectors should be based on political loyalty or affiliation with the ruling party. And that there is no legitimate ground for power in the public sphere outside the ideology of the ruling political party. Now, this is not only... most of us think of populism as a right-wing thing, but there are actually also left-wing populists. This is López Obrador, the ruling president in Mexico. And this is from a colleague, Market Silva Herzog. He says, López Obrador approaches public administration as a landlord relates with its servants. He can snap his fingers and reduce their salaries. He can fire them if he wants. He can change their working schedule from one day to another without taking care about what the law says. And López Obrador is about to fire 180,000 civil servants in Mexico. So there should be no one working in the civil service, not even head of a local post office, who is not a member of his party. So it's not only right-wing, there is also left-wing populists here. So over to quality of government. What is this? Here is the handbook that I and 4 colleagues published last year on Oxford University Press. Andreas Bogenholm, Monica Bauer, Marcia Grimes and I. And it's 39 chapters, 900 pages. You have to read everything here. But basically, we think the norm for carrying out public policies should be some form of impartiality in the exercise of public power. So this rules out nepotism, favoritism, bribes, kickbacks, and various forms of discrimination based on ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, etc. This is also in the Swedish constitution, that everyone, not only public servants, but also private organizations that are implementing public policies, has to obey 3 rules: equality before the law, impartiality, and the Swedish saklighet, which is a little difficult to translate, but it's a kind of matter of factness. You cannot take things into account that shouldn't be taken into account according to the policy that you are supposed to implement. This goes back to John Rawls, and this is one of my favorite quotes from him. There are many. For it, if it is supposed that institutions are reasonably just, then it is of great importance that the authorities should be impartial and not influenced by personal, monetary, or other irrelevant consideration in the handling of particular cases. So this is how he thinks about this. So the quality of government approach, it differentiates between quality of democracy and quality of government. You can have the one and not the other. Usually they go together, but not always. So democracy, you can say, is based on ideological partisanship. You become active in politics because you want something for something, right? Nobody becomes active in politics because they want to implement impartiality, which is the norm for what we think is quality of government. You can say this is the rule of law, yes, but it also includes the importance of impartiality for the many experts, professions and semi-professions that implement public policies. Teachers, doctors, social security administrations, and so on. So this is an anathema to corruption, but also to other dysfunctions such as clientelism, patronage, politicization, and so on. Why is this important? Here is some very, very simple scatter plots. So here I have the Human Development Index and the Electoral Democracy Index. And you can see 0.22, it's not very impressive. The correlation is not that strong. There are quite a number of countries up here and not so few countries down there, right? So you can have the other, but not the one. But change to if you can get control of corruption and you get something. This is my favorite measure of human well-being. No, it's not. It's life expectancy at birth, sorry. I actually like how many years you can live without being ill. Healthy living. But here, and you have electoral democracy, 0.19, very little. But change to control of corruption and you get something. And do you get richer living in a democracy? Not much, but look at this. So I can show you 40 another such scatter plots. The point is very simple, that it's not actually electoral democracy that delivers human well-being. It's much more control of corruption, government effectiveness, and the rule of law. And here is the sad question: will electoral democracy cure corruption? And as you can see, the answer is no. The curve is U-shaped. So you have quite a number of countries down there who have quite good democracy but also highly corrupt. And then you have about the same number of countries who have very bad or no democracy but that actually managed to get some control over corruption.
Bosse, perhaps you should say something about what you mean with electoral democracy. Is it just about the input side, or for those who don't know?
It's free elections. It's standard parliamentary election. This, I think, come from the Vidam Institute's measure of if you have free and fair elections that are run in a reasonably okay way and producing what we know as majorities and so on.
So just the input side. So
it's only the input side, yeah. Nothing is there. If you take the output side, then if everything is in, you cannot do this distinction, right? And as you know, the Swedish international aid has been very much centered on establishing electoral democracy in countries like Afghanistan and so. Best of luck, I say. Why is democracy not a safe cure against low quality of government? Well, there are a number of things we found. In newly democratized weak states, the political majorities that comes to power by election, they are unable to withstand a number of temptations. One is to reward their political followers with jobs in the public sector. If you take South Africa, this is what has ruined much of their public administration. They actually now have difficulties to produce very simple, not simple, but very standard basic utilities, electricity, water, and so on. You get political appointment of judges. Since they usually have a lack of funding for election campaigns, this leads them to plunder the public coffers for financing their elections. Nepotism seems to be a very strong human motivation, unfortunately. And if you look historically at it, almost all the strong democracies in Northwestern Europe first solved the problem of endemic corruption, then they became democracy, not the other way around. And there is a logic to this, actually. If you do not have an impartial election administration, the losing side in election won't accept the result. So you first have to solve this. It's known as the sequency debate in political science. This is what I mentioned before. Voters lack the needed capacity. We see often that notoriously corrupt politicians are unfortunately often re-elected. So if you take the local elections in South Africa and elections in Southern Africa, this comes from Mark Lieberman. Voters punish politicians with a good record in producing much needed public goods. This is a little sideshow. There are some colleagues who think that deliberative or participatory democracy can solve this problem. In theory, yes, it's a very cute idea. And when demos is relatively small or questions restrained, it can work. But in practice, for large-scale nations with many complex and interrelated issues, I think probably not. I like the idea, but I don't think it will work. Expert rule, should we have that? Are there experts in politics? I think Robert Dahl's warning in his legendary book, Democracy and Its Critics, is still relevant. He warns against these political experts and that they also have their agenda and they cannot be trusted always. And the track record, I would say, is only modestly impressive if you have only experts. We have in economics what was known as the Washington Consensus from the World Bank. Didn't go so well, I can say. The regulation of financial markets, maybe not. And we have a huge failure of the anti-corruption regime around the world. I mean, 25 years ago, many organizations, the UN and many others, and many international aid organizations started anti-corruption regimes. It didn't work. So it's very hard to get figures here, but we tried. And these figures are not perfect, but we tried by asking colleagues in other countries, if there is a change in government after an election, how many civil servants will have to leave? And the highest figure we found is Mexico, first 70,000, but this new left-wing president wants to change 180,000. Brazil, 24,000, Argentina, 22, South Africa, 10,000, United States, 4,000, Italy, 1,500. The lowest figure we found is Denmark. In Denmark, a new minister brings in one person. In Sweden, we have some 200-300 maybe. So yeah, and this Denmark figure is a little fun because there are two well-known anti-corruption scholars or development scholars who coined the phrase that what developing countries needs to do is to get to Denmark. They should be like Denmark. Yeah. What do you get with this political colonization of the public administration? You get low competence, both when it comes to true and fair. we have studies showing that in developing countries you get serious disruption of aid and development programs. The new bureaucrats don't want to implement the earlier government's programs. They want new programs, and this creates problems. You get, of course, various forms of corruption and clientelism. You get increased polarization, and this is very serious. We found that there are many reasons for the outbreak of civil wars, but one reason that is very clear is that if you, after an election, there is a risk that you will lose your job. That is a very clear factor behind civil wars in extreme cases. So, what can you do? Our cure for this is meritocracy in the public administration. All things being equal, meritocracy would feed the system with more knowledge. The best system seems to be a balanced one with two groups that have different sources of legitimacy and therefore can check each other out. Servants who are not directly dependent on and therefore not loyal to elected politicians. Their sort of source of legitimacy is their professional peers. And here empirics comes in quite handy. This is a measure we have constructed by expert web-based survey where we try to measure the degree of impartiality in the recruitment to public service. And on the other hand, we have a simple, what we call good society index constructed by my colleague Søren Holmberg. The problem with the UN index is that it consists of some 60 variables. And the problem with that everything that can explain the variation is already in the index. So this is a much simpler one. It consists of only three things. Infant mortality, expected living, and then degree of happiness or satisfaction with life. So the good society, you survive as a baby, you live a pretty long life, and in between you are pretty satisfied with your situation. It correlates very well with the other one. So here you get something. Does it work against corruption? Yes, it does. The more meritocratic the recruitment is, the lower is the corruption. What are the mechanisms here? And here I rely basically on my two colleagues at the Quality of Government Institute, Carl Dahlström and La Puente. They show in a book with the fantastic title, Organizing the Leviathan, that it's not actually the closed Weberian German Spanish system that produces the good results, in the meaning that you have a very formalized, you take an exam when you're 23, then you enter the public administration, and then you sort of move upwards like a clockwork. It's like a silo basically. It's more the open Australian, Canadian, Nordic system where you actually try to evaluate the applicant's real merits, not only merits on paper or years. That gives the effect. And what they show is that the mechanism could be the construction of a deliberative process between the two groups. Both have to convince the other by argument. So you have a little too opportunistic politicians, and then you have the meritocratic, highly recruited, high civil servants. And if they have to enter into a deliberative process, that is what they see will produce good results when it comes to control of corruption and human well-being. So the medicine should be here not ruled by experts, but rules through experts. That sort of you have to take the little too opportunistic politicians have to take their ideas through the evaluation of experts before they can. So this is the book. Yeah. Yes, this seems to be very simple solution. And should be in line with what many things. Meritocracy, yes, of course, and this is also according to the Swedish constitution how it should work. You should only get your position by förtjänst och skicklighet. But there are actually in the social sciences at least 4 quite important approaches that questions this. First, you have the economic theory, also in political science, known as public choice, saying that it's all about self-interest. There is nothing such as impartiality. It's impossible. Also, the civil servants are only in there for their own self-interest. And then you can forget everything about impartiality in the production of knowledge. And then, of course, you have the opposite, Foucauldian analysis. It's all about power. So there is no such thing as impartial, non-interested, non-self-serving expert knowledge here. It's all about power. And then, of course, you have identity politics. Impartiality over identity is neither possible nor desirable. So the idea that Gustav here as a white lower upper class, can I say that? Male Swedish professor could make an impartial decisions of immigrant female student who has special sexual orientation that is not yours, I won't ask. That's impossible. And it's also not desirable. It shouldn't work like this. And then, of course, postmodernism, impartial knowledge expert, that's just a mirage. It doesn't exist. So to my surprise, I found out that this idea of impartiality is much more controversial than I thought when I started this. You can, of course, add classical Marxism. It's all about serving the ruling capitalist class. There are not many left of us, but a few at least. So, some preliminary conclusion. The principle of meritocracy in recruitment and promotion to the public administration and public service is one way to answer Cohen's question of where the independent standard of correct decisions should come from. There is a link between quality of government and impartiality that leads to meritocracy that is important for securing the epistemic qualities of democracy. And populism leading to political colonization of the state is the opposite to securing these epistemic qualities of democracy. And my final argument, this may be the real problem with populism. It will destroy the epistemic recruitment for truth in democratic decisions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bosse. Very interesting. There are lots of questions. Since we're both online and people are here, I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. So, first half hour will be recorded, and for you online, we will use the chat function to ask the questions. And so you write it in the chat. And as we are mixed researcher, please also write your discipline. And we also go for both hand, which is a new question, and fingers, which are follow-up. And I'm ruthless in denying people using their finger for hands, so just so you know. And I see there's a number of hands up. I start with Christer, and then I'll write down the rest of the names.
Thank you, Bo. This is sort of a question of clarification, I think. A lot of these claims, I think, depend on whether you go for unqualified or qualified definitions of things. So you talk about different kinds of democracy. And you also mentioned there's a notion of liberal democracy, right? Which I understand you admit is more extended and might include output requirements. And if you put that into these graphs, you might have a perhaps better correlation between that kind of democracy and nice things. And of course, on the other side, you have meritocracy, which also can be qualified, as you said, where it can be seen as just the sort of formal educational merits, which of course depends on this educational system, which can be corrupt, right? So it has to then be qualified that too, right? So all these claims has to be clearly qualified, I guess. And sometimes I wasn't sure exactly what qualification went in and was excluded, especially when it comes to meritocracy, actually.
Yeah, I can only agree. The problem with including liberal democracy here, that in many definitions they include the rule of law. And then sort of the rule of law is of course all against, works against corruption. So then you have already included it in there. But if you do not include it, the difference wouldn't be much. That's my memory of working with the statistics here. And of course, you're right about meritocracy, that also should be defined. My take on meritocracy is Churchillian. It's actually not a good working system, but all the alternatives are worse. That's how I think about it. We know from many studies that there is subconscious discrimination and many other things that works against the meritocracy. But I actually think that meritocracy, when it's used in practice, is closer to its ideal than is democracy. If you think of democracy, that all of us should have equal say in governing the state, every known democracy is light years away from this, of course. So I actually think meritocracy is actually a little closer to the ideal in practice than is democracy.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, let me just follow up on that, because I took Chris's question a little bit different way, maybe, that there's this problem of communicating. You can't just have meritocracy without having, for example, some kind of equal schools or something like that. And actually, to do a more charitable reading of Foucault than you do, you can read Foucault's talking about what we come to hold us true depends on, for example, who has power over the schools. And so you have this whole kind of, so even though you have meritocracy, if you had this, very good schools for the upper class but not for other people, you will get a kind of biased view probably of society throughout the system.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, but in most of the societies that manage to handle this problem of systemic corruption, one thing that came very early in their development was actually public schools.
For a good reason.
Yeah, for a good reason, yeah. And together with an American colleague, Rick Juslainer, we've written about this. The public schools are very interesting because you would think that it would be the most, if you're a Marxist or a logic of industrialist thinker, you would think that the most economically developed countries started. England. Now, England is a latecomer, 1906. What country is first out? Militaristic, autocratic, Juncker-dominated Prussia, Germany. 1806, a gigantic reform. Why? It's all about state building. The year before, they had lost badly against the French. The French start in 1878. A fantastic book by sociologist Eugene Weber, Making Frenchmen Out of Peasants. I can highly recommend it. And why? The year before, they were beaten by the Germans. And there is also a Swedish, an American who studied the Swedish change here, John Bowley, New Citizens for a New State, that makes the same argument. It was all about state building. Asking the Swedish researchers in history of schools about this, they are now a little, how should I say, embarrassed, saying, yeah, he was right, but we disregarded him because we were all Marxist at that point. It's now 25 years ago, yeah. But Bowley's book can also be highly recommended. So of course you're right. It depends on that you first have some way for ordinary people to make progress. But that actually happens before you get some reasonable control of corruption in these countries.
Pontus, you have a follow-up to this?
The same with the notion that the notion that meritocracy might not be well measured in these things goes to the opposite of his point. So if it's poorly measured because there are some corrupt schools and so on, that will lower the real effect of meritocracy that he sees in the data. So
Yeah,
makes
that
the
was not my
effect of
point.
democracy even stronger.
Yeah.
That was not my
Yeah.
point at all.
Then I misunderstood.
My point was that even if you have meritocracy in a formal sense, there will be this problem if you have kind of a biased school system that privileges certain groups.
Yes, but Christer's point was about data.
Well, maybe.
I misunderstood you as well. Okay.
Anyway, it was
none
an interesting point
of
anyway.
these measures are perfect. I must say that. Yeah, but I think the tendency is pretty clear. If you have these many measures as that we have, that all points in one direction, you have something. But none of them are, of course, perfect. Far from it. It's very hard to measure these things. But the impartiality index that we have constructed depends on, I think, 12 questions to people who are supposed to be experts in their own country about how the system works. So it's not one question: are you a meritocracy or not? It's a index of, I think, 12 questions that we constructed. So but you know, measuring corruption, meritocracy, and all these things is very, very hard.
Anna, you get a microphone.
Thank you. That was fascinating. I have a question about the validation of experts in this meritocratic dream regime. Of course, I'm thinking of my own studies of hobby experts on Facebook. People talking about giving advice about how to think and act about crisis online in social media. And we have analyzed the different expert advice going around the first wave of COVID. And the 31 most shared posts out of those 31, they were together shared more than 550,000 times. I think 90% had an authority claim that was not expert knowledge. It was experience, it was a lot of visuals, it was personal, it was emotional language, and even out of platform builders, that people who actually managed to establish platforms, only 2 out of 10 had some remote type of expertise that we would count as expertise. So how do you, and of course politicians are social animals and they're responsive, they want to be, so they are put under immense pressure to reevaluate their own concept of what an expert is. So how do we handle that?
Good question. Of course, there can be self-acclaimed experts. What my colleagues here are trying to measure and think about is the actual recruitment to high-level civil servants. So you become the head of the National Bureau for Health or senior advisor in the Department of in the Ministry of Economics and so on. So it's not sort of self-acclaimed experts that, and then their idea is that if the politicians have to run what they want to do through the experts, you get the better decision. Far from perfect, of course. So I think that is how many of us think about climate, for example, now. That they have to run it through the experts before they do it. And at least I am worried now that we have a government who disregard what the majority of the experts that have been recruited themselves, who are heads of many Swedish national board and agencies, says this is a bad strategy, for we will not reach the this 1.5%, 1.5 degrees. So it's more that type of expert knowledge than you go out and say, who can be an expert here? Come with advice. That's not how we think it works. Yeah. Or should work. Yeah. So we're not arguing for expert rules. That's not. It's a. You can say it's to take the idea of deliberative democracy but put it in another area.
Okay.
I mean, if you go back to some of the more successful Swedish reforms that I studied in labor market policy and educational policy from the 1940s, 50s and 60s. That is how the public commissions actually worked. You put together experts and politicians, and they had to sort this out somehow. So some of the more successful and long-lasting reforms have had this type of combination of experts and politicians. Not first the politicians and then the experts, but they have argued together and investigated the problems together.
Good. Pontus, you had a hand too? So go for it. We'll wait for the microphone this time. There.
Okay, so thank you for the talk. I've seen you talk on this a couple of times, and interesting to see the evolution of the new puzzle pieces. And the one that really struck me this time was the notion of populists wanting a more grander executive, or the executive being the boss of everything. And I'm wondering if you can comment on if you think this is because they think normatively that this is how it should be, or if this is their belief of how it is all the time. Because it seems to me that when the Social Democrats are in power, and some expert at the Migration Office says that all Syrians have asylum reasons, and the Social Democratic government says, well, then all Syrians will get asylum here. The Swedish Democrats would say that it's the Social Democrats who have, that the executive have just decided that they don't acknowledge that there are experts, or the courts are corrupt because they don't like the party in power and so on. So do you think this is their belief about how the world works, and do you know if anyone has studied that?
I would like to know. Actually, I don't know. My guess is that it's a little of both. So both that they think, and I think maybe this is the strongest. If I now pay for various reasons attention to Italian politics, and if I look at the populists there, that is how they think. The first, that they have a totalitarian view of democracy, meaning that there should be no role for independent universities or cultural institutions, and so. In Sweden, it could also be that since we have had one party who held power for, I think, 75 of the last 100 years, which is a world record, I can very well imagine that many Sweden Democrats, and there are populists also in the other parties, I should say, think that the Social Democrats have colonized parts of the civil service and public administration. There is one tendency here, and that is a number of national board and agencies. It used to be that we had national board and agencies who sort of got a mandate from the parliament and the government, and then was supposed to implement that out in the country. Some 20 years ago there was a change, so especially Social Democrat, but also some more center right-wing government put up a new type of national board and agencies that didn't have this sort of big mandate to implement it. They were more, I used a term from a Marxist philosophers who was one en vogue, Louis Althusser. It's more like ideological state apparatuses. So they were more into trying to sell a special vision about how society should work, both to the population, but also working as a lobby group against the government and the parliament. So they can have an argument for that. We once had Glesbygdsverket, for example, or many other such national board and agencies that were put up basically for ideological reasons. Yeah. So I think it's a little of both, or in their minds. But yeah, we should interview them.
Yes.
Very good. I guess it's time to go to the political science bench in the audience. So Ludwig.
Thank you, Bo. So I had a question about the relationship between meritocracy, impartiality, and its relationship to populism. So I was trying to understand the point here. So meritocracy is, as you mentioned here, applies both to individual cases, like cases should be handled alike, but it also applies to recruitment, so that it's a meritocratic recruitment process. That, on the other hand, seems to overlap with the requirements of meritocracy. So you cannot have meritocracy without having impartial recruitment, in a sense. So it seems like there's a partial, at least, overlap between what impartiality requires and what meritocracy requires. But it's just a partial overlap, because I think meritocracy also implies other things that are not necessarily part of the concept of impartiality. So if you think about meritocratic organizations that are guided by professional norms or scientific norms, the idea is there is that, well, important decisions about what we should do should be based on the sort of general consensus in the profession or something like that. That is not a requirement of impartiality, I think. I think you can have impartiality both in recruitment and in the application of norms without having that kind of decision-making process. But the interesting thing here is now two things. One is that populism can challenge these kind of institutions in two senses. One is that they undermine the recruitment process. Your examples were mainly of that sort. But you don't have to undermine the recruitment process in order to be a populist and try to govern institutions ideologically. You can just give them directives that they should pursue that are very ideological. And they can be impartially executed, I guess. So if the Swedish Democrats in government would say that all political scientists in Sweden should only study nationalist something, they should give us very terrible, try to steer science in Sweden in general. They don't need to sort of undermine the recruitment process of scientists. They don't need to sort of how we grade students or anything. They don't need to mixture with that. They can just give us a new ideological ends that we should pursue. So isn't there there are different ways at least in which populists may challenge these things, and only one of them is actually against impartiality. And that leads me to the final thing here. When you say that impartiality leads to meritocracy, that was your final slide. Well, it seems to one extent it leads to it by definition if we look at recruitment, because that is what impartiality implies. On the other hand, it's not so obvious to me how impartiality leads to meritocracy if we think about the decisions made within public institutions. I just wonder what you thought about this. This was my impressions of your talk. Thanks.
No, I agree. I mean, almost all professions that we think of are based on meritocracy also have a set of professional norms and ethics that they should obey. Lawyers, researchers, social workers, and so on. And there is, of course, no guarantee that impartiality will produce good outcomes. You could, in theory, have a concentration camp run impartially. But here again, I rely on rules. He speaks about it's much more probable that if institutions are run in this impartial way, it's much more likely that they will also adhere to principles of justice. And you have the same problem with democracy. I mean, with electoral democracy, there is no guarantee that the majority will not decide to make soap out of the minority, right? But it's quite unlikely, we hope. So in both cases, we are dealing with probabilities here. Then I think the professional norms and ethics in most professions cannot really be separated from the knowledge thing, clearly. The truth thing. It's the professional norms and ethics are usually very clearly connected that you should apply knowledge in impartial way when you handle cases. Then they add a number of requirements. So, for example, in the medical profession, you should apply scientific knowledge or proven experience in cases, but then they add that when you have not enough resources, the serious cases should come beforehand the not so serious cases, to take a simple. But it's connected here, so there is not really a disconnect, I think, between the truth thing and the norm thing in what professions are doing. At least I have, that's my impression, but again, I'm mixing here, so I'm not a specialist in, I haven't gone very deep into this, but this is my impression that they have. But we are speaking about probabilities. I have a number of very nice quotes from Rawls when he says this. It's a probability, it's not a guarantee that if you have impartiality you would get a more just outcome, but it increases much the likelihood.
Happy with that? Okay, so I got a bit...
Not really, but
yeah.
I can't do better.
I got a bit confused, so let me ask you this. So you have merits for a position, and that will be how well you're going to perform. They're going to be relevant for how well you perform that position. Now, we can have more or less good ideas about that. Maybe we are looking at the wrong merits. But we can still be impartial when we apply that. So impartiality doesn't guarantee that you get the best or the most meritocratic appointment. Or do you think that
but
if it's impartial, we have to have exactly the right kind of list of merits?
It's important, the finding from Dahlström and Lapuente, that we shouldn't have a too formalized view about merits. It should be actual how well you can perform the service you're supposed to do. So we shouldn't count just years or...
I agree. But my idea is,
like
let's say we did a little bit wrong. So we forgot some important merit. Are we then less impartial? I don't think so.
Well, impartiality is more like it shouldn't count if you have the right party book, or if your gender, or your looks, or your political contacts. It's more basic.
Exactly. So
if you go into the very fine details, I mean, think when we are, both you and I have to make decisions about who should get the position in our projects and so.
But then you have an answer to his question. So it doesn't follow from that something is impartial that we get the optimal meritocratic system.
No. It doesn't. Yeah. It's again a probability.
Good. Okay, I think it's time to move to the sociologists. Stefan.
Yes, thank you. I have two comments. One is on what populists actually do once they're in power. And I think that in addition to what you mentioned, colonizing the state, I think they also do something else that could be summarized as intermediaries out. And that is that they target the stratum that they see as kind of tainting the relationship between the people and their true representatives. And that stratum of intermediaries that consist of, for example, social scientists. They don't have a problem with medical research and natural research and so on. They do have a problem with social science because they think that the researchers are left-wing, they are biased, they follow their own agendas, etc., etc. They are targeting journalists because journalists are also left-wing. They represent the Lügenpresse. They target writers, artists, cultural producers in the broad sense because they also kind of taint this relationship that they want to see as a pure and unmediated relationship. So that is, I think, one thing they do, and I think you can hear it in the rhetoric already now from the Sweden Democrats. My other comments is about how you get these epistemic qualities, the independent standards of truth, etc. I think that impartiality and meritocracy are important ingredients, but I think they are far from enough. And I think there is a need to look at how should I put it, the reliability and the quality in the process in which expertise is produced. And I think even in a country like Sweden, you can see, I mean, clear deficiencies in this regard. For example, in the work on expert reports that I and Erika Falkenström have been doing, you can see that, I mean, experts are recruited on the basis that they are known, that they belong to certain academic disciplines, etc. The experts typically rather focus ready-made policy solutions rather than actually pointing to the real problems. They receive very little feedback in the process where they actually produce this knowledge, and once they report, they don't really know what happens to what they have produced. And I think even, I mean, the public commissions, the SOUs, they are not really what they used to be.
No.
And I think they are, at this point, many of them quite deficient in all these, and not to mention the kind of independent consulting reports and whatever is produced in so on. So I think that would be an additional dimension.
Yeah, what can I say? I agree. No, but I think they, of course, are selective in which type of experts they attack, and it's unlikely that they would make a big attack on the medical profession. But for example, the profession that study ecology and climate change, I think they will go after. And they are not very different from the medical people, I think. So I think they have a little broader idea of this. And then journalists, of course, they want their own journalists. There is nothing such as impartial or independent media. They will go after public service in many countries. They have already done that. In Hungary and Poland, they will go after judges and the courts, I think. The second thing, I agree, of course, that we have become a little too lenient when it comes to recruitment to experts in many areas, not least in the public in the SOU commissions, yeah. And in the area you and Erika have looked at, it's obvious. But there I think it's a little special organization that have a little too much influence, if I may say so. So, but that's maybe that's a special Swedish case. But as you saw, I started that, rule by experts overall have not always turned out very well. You can go back actually to, we had an economic policy in the late 1980s and early 1990s known as the norm politics in economics. That went completely astray, and some of you may remember that we ended up with an interest rate of 500% in 1991. Now, when they were interviewed, and the economist, and they basically, there were hardly any dissenting voices then from the economist. I was there. They said, well, we were convinced to 51% that our theory was right, but we argued in the public as if we were convinced to 100%. So, yeah, there are experts and experts, I would say, here. So it's far from, and that is why I argue against this, rule by experts. This is the argument from Brennan and other anti-democrats, that we should give over everything to the experts. I think that would be insane. But I think maybe enlightened, maybe I'm too romantic, but maybe an enlightened procedure between the elected politicians and the expert could give better results than if we leave it to either one of them. That is the simple message here.
Actually, I think that the thing about 51 and 100%, I think that comes from Tingsten originally.
Yeah. No, they referred back to Tingsten, but Tingsten was different. He didn't claim, he did this not as a professor in political science. That was when he was editor of the main Dagens Nyheter here. And so they refer directly back to Tingsten, of course. And I think that was a big mistake from them.
They misunderstood him.
Yeah, you could also say that, yeah.
Good. We have a finger on this gentleman there.
Thank you, Bo. for a very interesting talk. I just have one question for you, and it's about populism and how they're taking over the state. And I'm thinking, you also mentioned this getting to Denmark, and how should we view the Danish case here? Because if we stay in Scandinavia, for instance, the threat here is, of course, the Sweden Democrats, while in Denmark, the Danish People's Party, they have basically imploded because the Social Democrats have taken over their core issues on immigration. So is the threat from populism, is it from policies or is it the actors? And how should we view?
Is it from the?
Is it based on the actors or is it the policies? And how should we view the Danish case? Do you see my point?
Yeah.
Populist party is gone, but their policies are still in place because of the Social Democratic Party. Is it still a threat?
Yeah, you can have all kinds of views about immigration policy here, but in many cases the policies from populists are not so much based on immigration. It's based on another idea of the people against the elite, I think. The Danish case, they have had a very stern immigration policy. There is a big difference between the populist parties in the Nordic countries, that the true Finns and the Norwegian party and the Sweden Democrat. None of the other parties in the other Nordic countries have this history of being connected to anti-democratic forces. If it's policies, yes, of course, since they argue from the nation, the immigration policy is very important for them. But you can also say that in Sweden, the other seven parties invited the Sweden Democrats to this. If you go back to 2014, 15, I think in 2015 Sweden took in 163,000 refugees. The other Nordic countries took in 30,000. And the implication is that the voter who said, I think we should have a very generous policy towards refugees. Let's take in double or triple or 4 times what Denmark didn't have anything to vote for. There was no alternative for this person who said, let's take in 100,000 or 120,000. And of course, if there is no alternative, that was a blank check to the Sweden Democrats for getting more votes, I think. So I think it's policy, but it's not only policy. That would be my answer.
Okay, so now for the economist, Erik Molin, behind there. You can get the microphone.
Everything is about identity here,
Yeah,
I hear.
I'm just doing identity politics now here, according to the subject.
Yeah, I will not ask anything that is about
I don't hear.
economics. Hi, I will not ask anything about economics. I was just wondering about, you make many causality claims, and of course you illustrate it with nice scatter plots, but I'm sure you have a much deeper analysis behind it. So you mentioned, for instance, the historical precedency of decreasing corruption in Western Europe before the introduction of democracy. But take another example. So you mentioned, you claimed, I think, that meritocracy causes impartiality.
No, the other way around.
Okay. Whatever.
Impartiality translates into meritocracy.
What does translate mean? Is this a causal claim?
If you have a principle of impartiality in the exercise of public power, and then the public sector have to recruit people, you will recruit them trying to be impartial when it comes to evaluating their merits.
Sure, but I could think of, we can construct mechanisms in the other direction. And so I was wondering, like, empirically, how do you approach this?
Empirically, we approach it by using all the standard statistical techniques, but also doing long historical case studies, where we use the method of process tracing, for example. where you can actually see what happens before the other thing happens on an aggregate level. But of course, if you go down to the micro level, in these studies, it's almost impossible to get what experimentalists would accept as causality. No, you can't.
Okay, then we go online. Ori.
Thank you. I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about deliberative democracy. So you mentioned it almost in passing. You sort of said something like, it's a cute idea, but in a large demos and when it comes to complex issues, it probably won't work. And I was wondering, first of all, when you say it probably won't work, did you mean that it probably cannot be properly implemented, or did you mean that it probably won't have these nice effects if implemented? And also I was wondering if this is a sort of claim based on your data, or is it like more a theoretical claim? I mean, are there any actual deliberative democracies that you can study empirically, or is it just sort of a claim based on theory? So I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about this.
The big name in deliberative democracy in political science is James Fishkin, and he has carried out quite large, you would say, real-time experiments, getting lots and lots of people to sit in for 2 or 3 days and discussing a problem, and then he can show that it actually what comes out is in all likelihood a more qualified decision than if they would just sit down and vote without having this discussion. And I accept this. The problems are two. First, it's utterly hard to get the representative type of people to participate in these experiments. It's usually people like us who are a little too interested, a little too leftist, a little too highly educated who go in there because you cannot force people to be part of this. And then, I mean, you can do it with maybe a couple of 100 persons, but think about that we have to make decisions in big nation states with millions and millions and millions of people. I cannot really see how you could create the deliberative process for this. Then you can have referendums, saying that if you have a referendum, this will force people to discuss much more and take more serious the issue than if you just have votes for parties. And that is a kind of deliberative process. Yeah, Sweden have had 6 referendums. My favorite is the referendum about driving on the left side or right side, where 83% voted for that we should continue to drive on the left side. And 6 years later, the parliament just ran it over, and 3 years later we changed. And most people in Sweden think this is one of the maybe smartest decisions Sweden have taken any time. And also the other referendums seem not really to have worked very well. So I think in small settings, I think deliberative democracy maybe in small companies, if they are run democratically, in research institutes, in housing cooperatives, I think it's a very good idea. I think in large settings I cannot really fathom how this would work. And Fishkin has not come up with something that can solve these two problems, I think.
So on that note, join me in thanking Bo for this lovely talk.
I should thank you. Thank you.
And we have next coming up on December 7th, Sede Hormio, Individual Emissions, Equality and the State, and December 14, Erik Wengström, Intended and Unintended Consequences of Financial Incentives. Very welcome then.